Here looking at ES, as we settle today, we find ourselves at a pivotal moment in the market activity. Give me a break. We always find ourselves at a pivotal moment. So let's bring everything back into a logical sense. So we had this Gaussian curve up here. We initiate, we build down below. And how are we doing holding above previous week's value high? Not great. Nope. We had some signs of that early on, or actually early in the afternoon, we're potentially pushing up into that. And so, nope, didn't happen. So the 4-week rolling, we have this large distribution, which primary LVN is down here at 5600s. Below us, we have the reference of the weekly pivot of 55, 56 half. And underneath that, we find ourselves in this large distribution down here. So tomorrow's the Fed. So let's be aware of the fact that where we're at right now, if we're above this previous week's 5-year high, then that's productive. And we can potentially push some upper range activity. If we're meandering in here, then we need to lean on those higher time frame structures and then slice that down to the intraday aspect in order to um, differentiate where we want to interact with the pivot balance zones that are going to update. I don't expect them to change here in the overnight session, but I would expect them to update, you know, if we have something tonight, we have some meaningful volume activity. But regardless, we're between the two zones right here between 56.12, 56.20. We have the weekly pivot down here at 55.56, but right off the open, we dipped our toe into that balance area and it was too cold. And so we drive up. We spend a ton of time right here just to rotate back and forth for a little bit of release of data or news, and then we rotate back into the bottom of the pip balance zones, rotate back and up, and along the way we had an anomaly, and that anomaly was down near the POC on the day, and so that's also covered in the OFL office hours recording, but from here, if we're maintaining back inside of these 5620s, I would expect us to begin to push and work our way back towards and through previous week's 5-year high. At least test it right up here. So above the 5620s, yes, leaning on that against this zone here, pushing into that, you have to gauge the activity for continuation because we had acceleration through that at the end of the day. And so scalping into that and then potential adds, if we're able to build above that, are clean. If we get above this, and it provides great opportunity for a long to push up into those 56-46 range, but we're stalling out, building a ton of buy delta, getting absorption, probably a good time to take some profit or just pause, exit, and allow for this to either build above or test back in and gauge that response from the lows. And Q, pretty similar activity. So we had Gaussian curve. We push down, we get acceleration. That acceleration is damn near the previous week's value high around the 937s. So that's the high volume edge currently on the week to date, whereas the LVN is around 980s. But we settle below. We have a large POC here. When I see this, I would like it to be smoothed. So how does that occur? Now let's dive into that. If we're not able to hold outside of the zones, we have to respect that for a potential push back into that POC. That POC is resting up around the 19,900s. And so we see the activity today. We weren't able to traverse this area between the zones, but instead we saw that dip outside, come back and in. We saw that at the end of the day. So if we're not able to get below the 820s, I would expect us to push up into the 900s to work here and also find some hesitation. Like I said, tomorrow we have Fed, but previous week's value high is at the 937 range. And so if we're building above that, I don't want to fight it. We have the potential to push against that 20,190 and find continuation. But under the 820s, then let it drift or get on board with it. Lean against that structure, get on board with it, and work your way down into the 649s to gauge for continuation. All right. So the first thing that comes to mind is, oh man, oh, potentially I'm new to this group or so forth. There's no way the simplicity of planning and so forth can be straightforward. Well, let me tell you. So we wind up with a Gaussian curve on ES, and what do we do when that occurs? You trade it as it's developed, right? If you begin to breach those zones, you begin to see that activity expand that range, and you pause. What are the references below us? Previous week's value area high, 56.46. We got pivot down here, 4-week rolling. We got the 5600s. We wind up building what? This distribution down here before we get that news event. We're testing back into previous week's value high, and we build it out a little further. And so how does this speak? And so as it is, we have potentially an exhaustive node. I don't particularly like it, but we have this push up into here, which has some skip volumes, some anomalies on the profile from today. And we also have Fed this week, and multiple things can happen. But from the big picture, we have references in areas where we can gauge response from and understand that something has changed. When we zoom in to the pivot balance zones, and the red line is just the VWAP that I've been talking about, VWAP, VWAP, VWAP. I really don't care how you say it. But essentially, as we're testing into that, and I like to refer to this as, oh, it's my stupid meter. What are you doing? Are you fighting? You fighting the trend? So the overnight session pushing down and in, we can see that begin to, as with reading any type of VWAP, you see that type to slow and so forth. But we have this zone down below us, and we've talked about the pivot balance zones, dipping our toe in. What happens if if the water's too cold? So we dip our toe in, water's too cold. When we wind up, logical next place to push back to is previous week's value area high, right here from the higher time frame. And we march straight through and we get there. Then what do we get? Well, we get some exciting activity through this. We push down in, leaves us off with where we were in chat as we're rocking into the 34 range. So there are two things about this that are consistent on my end, which was, well, we're right here around the 38 LVN. Test our toe into this lower distribution. Are we going to build that out and leave that LVN? Or are we going to test in and fail? And so as we're coming into this, these 34s right here, and we're just fighting back and forth on that. My expectation from that was, yeah, the overall picture is we're holding below previous week's value high, but I honestly just don't like to fight this. And so if that's going to bid there, we need to bid, but also we need to show some gusto around previous week's value high. We need to respect the fact that pivot is right here and we don't want to auction below it. And so that's where that came from. On NQ, pretty similar. Not only do we have a ton of volume right here around 19,900s, but two distributions. And as we dipped our toe in the upside with this news event, immediately it was reversed, but we left some anomalies. That's okay. But this POC here should get smoothed out. And so when we look into this aspect, getting below the pivot balance zones, my full expectation was, okay, primary LVN at 720s. Naturally, the high volume edge is up in here, but would like to see that pushing. But based upon this response and move up and out and have an ES align with that, speaks volumes, no pun intended, but also accounts for the fact that up here, before all of this activity, we weren't able to find any action to the downside. Every single time we were pushing down and in, we couldn't even get a pivot test initially. We're just building in a bunch of negative volume. Delta map was slinging some red candles that were getting reversed immediately, and we're rotating. However, on the 30-minute aspect here, we're putting in these lows, all these lows. So I don't like that. It doesn't sit well with me, and I don't like to blindly trade into that. But when I see that as, oh, there's participation here that is meaningful because it's protecting this area. And once we swept that zone, come down and in, then you have to be aware of the fact that A period was all the way down here. B period was an outside bar. We also had singles that got closed, but along the way, we weren't able to even progress to the bottom of autoplot, right? So um, putting all of that into context might be a little bit daunting. So simplify things. Simplify things from the higher time frame aspect of where are we at? We're below it. Understand that if you're going to counter, then put a starter on, make it smaller. If it begins to feed you, then work in some ads. What was the saying that XYZ said on his stream about 10 ticks?
Cut your teeth for 10 ticks, or
Um,
Right.
I'm gonna have to ask him. Yeah.
it was
Tooth,
pithy.
Tooth and nail for 10.
tooth and nail for 10. That was it. That was good. I mean, because that's accurate. So when you're looking at absorption and you're on the wrong side of that coin and you're fighting tooth and nail for 10, you might be you might be on the wrong side. Where's the trade thesis off? And so define that to begin with before entering that trade. But as it begins to move, if you're fighting tooth and nail for 10, then I'm totally on board with that. I love it. And something to consider. At any point, you can find a setup that can pull in the points you need if you are to cut because you're actually seeing or observing the opposite side of trade come in against where you're positioned. And I, for one, am somebody who likes to take profit um, at a zone where this looks like a setup against me, right? So we saw some of that. We saw some of that out of here on this little build to the upside. We had a lot of buy delta build up until here. We weren't able to overtake the previous week's value year high. The plan out of this was to see this push down in, find a rebid to push previous week's value year high. Did not get it. So thesis is off. Where is it off? Essentially under the 58s at that point. And so we get under pivot on ESN NQ, and it doesn't mean if you're long up into one of these pullbacks, you hold it all the way down into pivot. No, no, make sure your stops are in place to be able to manage that appropriately. But reentry should be seen with any type of exhaustive move down into that and push. So what about when it fails and then comes back into zone? It's back on the table. Back on the table, zone to zone. What happens when we step out of a pivot balance zone and we come back inside? It's back on the table, right? So in looking at ES here, what does this spike to the upside and this move to the downside say? Honestly, it it looks okay, back into some balance, but at the bottom of this zone after testing and failing through here. And naturally, we have some Fed speak and stuff tomorrow, but balance. Leave value, come back into value, look to traverse value, and rotate through here, and don't get hell bent on extension from it. But I'm going to open the floor. If anybody wants to chat on anything from today,